Hey guys, this is Jack with the Course in the Chaos. Today I want to do just a quick book review on a book that I was pretty excited when I heard about it called, just hold it up here, re-release. It's actually a re-release. This book came out, I think, originally in the 90s, and this has been adapted and changed a little bit for modern times. But I will tell you, it was compelling how relevant it was for today. But the book was written back in the 90s. It's James Montgomery Boice's Two Cities, Two Loves. And when I heard that this was going to be released by P&R Publishing, I was pretty excited. You know, over the years, lots of ink has been spilled on analyzing and discussing the problem and the tension between Christ and culture. Most notably, I'll hold this up. In fact, I love this book. It's a classic work, Christ and Culture by H. Richard Niebuhr. One of my favorite books. And you know, this is one of those books, truly a classic. There are books written about this book. It's been around a long time, and it is extremely helpful in a lot of ways. So when you want to do an analysis on the relationship between Christianity and culture and looking at the various types of relationships, you know, this is the book that I would go to, right? But the one thing that I didn't like about it, maybe not to say didn't like, but I found it thin on, not that I disliked it. It was good at what it was aimed at doing, would have been biblical exposition and more practical activity of this is how we live in the world now. And to be fair to Niebuhr, you know, that was not his aim. Again, he was more concerned with examining the complexities of the relationship models, Christ over culture, Christ in culture, Christ transforming culture, all these different things, looking at their models, their ethics, their challenges. And on that front, it's a great book, truly is a classic. Nevertheless, I was excited when I heard this book was coming out because it was aimed at providing Christian responsibility in a crumbling culture. I was hoping for biblical guidance, practical wisdom, and I will tell you, it hit the mark. So what I want to do here is quickly, and it won't be too much longer, but I just want to do a quick review of this book. The book's broken up into two parts. The first part is really aimed at giving a scriptural background to this idea of the conflict between Christians and the culture. Where did it come from? How did it originate? Where do we see that in the Bible? And I'll say with no exaggeration, I found this aspect of the book absolutely fascinating. I'd never seen or heard or read someone put together such a comprehensive description of this complex relationship and where it's rooted in and where it originally came from. But probably since Augustine's City of God. And again, he uses that, I think, as a prototype as he demonstrates how the history of God's people has been in this constant tension with the world. And what he does is he describes, similar to Augustine's City of God, you've got two cities. You have the city of God and the city of man. The city of God aims to glorify God, and the city of man aims to glorify man. And we see this in Scripture, and this is what he points out, and I found really compelling, how you see this throughout Scripture in a number of ways in the city of Babylon. With Nimrod and Babel, right? You've got all that. You have ancient Babylon that brought the Israelites into captivity. And then you have Babylon in Revelation, and how the enemy, Satan, has constantly worked to reestablish the city of man throughout history for personal gain and selfish ambition. And again, for some that may be obvious. To me, I just never quite connected the dots the way that Boice does in this book. And I found it truly fascinating, just a very fascinating, but it sets great context and a great setting for what's going to come in the second half of the book. So it's a strong foundation as you get into the second half, which is more focused on practical living. So he begins again to address, what do we do with this? You know, looking at these lessons of men like Daniel, looking at Israel, looking at this conflict of the city of man and the city of God, at least in a spiritual sense, that we see in Scripture. Boice begins to paint a picture then of how God's people should live in that culture, and specifically in a culture that's, you know, morally bankrupt and crumbling. And I mentioned a few minutes ago how interesting it was to me that this book, written in the 90s, was so incredibly relevant on topics and approaches today, and maybe even more so, right? Because a lot of the issues, cultural issues, and the moral say decomposition, the breaking down of morality within our culture has continued since then. Like, it's gotten worse, I would argue, since the 90s. So looking at the way he addresses these things from the 90s, how even more relevant it is today. I found that particularly interesting. Another thing that Boice does that I appreciated was he admitted fault, and I found his analysis on this quite interesting. He admitted fault that basically evangelicals have not done a good job at addressing the culture. And one of the ways that he said this, and I had to think about this for a while, and in the end, I think I agree with him. I might say it a little bit differently than he does. I think it's in chapter 7, if I remember correctly, but he essentially criticizes Christians for approaching issues largely from the perspective of their benefit while ignoring the argument for the greater good of society. And he basically says, and here's a quote from it: if Christians are to gain a hearing in the rough and tumble of the political arena, they must be willing to fill the gaps, showing how a suggested program best expresses and advances the desired principle. Moreover, Christians must argue their case with unbelievers, appealing to them on the behalf of what is good for them and their society. So he's really encouraging Christians to be involved in politics and government and all these things and push after it. But don't just stand there and quote scripture. Use scripture, be guided by reason, but present it in such a way that you're appealing to the behalf of what's good for the mass of society. And he goes into quite a bit of depth on that. And I found that a pretty interesting analysis in some areas. So, if you happen to read this book and you get to that, again, I think it was chapter 7, but if you get to that and take a look at it, I'd be curious of your thoughts on that. He also adds to that if we only quote scripture at non-believers for the purpose of kind of secular gain or secular political approaches, and we just call them heathens, you're heathens, and we just quote scripture, we'll make no ground. And he argues for a balanced approach, scripture plus reason. And he gives the example, and I would agree with him here because one of my heroes, but William Wilberforce, and his multi-year effort to abolish the slave trade. He did it certainly guided by scripture and principles, but there was also reason. When he stood in front of Parliament and he argued for the abolishment of slave trade, he didn't just quote scripture, but he used reason and politics and economy and certainly morality. He didn't shy away from morality, how immoral it was, but how all these things combined was for the betterment of all peoples. So kind of an interesting example there, but I would align there with Boice, and I think it was a very interesting aspect of the book and well said. And then the end of the book, I found very, very pastoral, I'll say, because he ends the book with a detailed look at Christ's high priestly prayer in John 17 and how it serves as a guide for how we must behave in a fallen world. So anyway, little quick book review. I'm in here, it's about 8 minutes. Hope that wasn't too long for you guys, but I don't give a ton of star ratings, but if I was pushed to say, I'd give 4.5 stars for James Montgomery Boice's Two Cities, Two Loves. It's not a perfect book, but it's an extremely helpful and needed piece on the topic of Christ and culture, and a really good, I'll say, counterpart or complementary book to Christ and Culture, the classic by Richard Niebuhr. Thanks so much. This has been Jack with The Course in the Chaos.